There are restaurants in this world where the waiting list is longer than most people's engagements, where the sommelier earns more than a junior surgeon, and where the unspoken rule is simple. If you have to ask what anything costs, you were never meant to be here. Auberge Nordique was that kind of place. Tucked into a converted Victorian townhouse on a quiet street in old Montreal, it had no sign out front, just a brass door handle worn smooth by decades of discretion. The chef, Edouard something Bordeaux, had 2 Michelin stars and a waiting list that stretched 8 months on a good day. The dining room held 32 seats, no more. The tablecloths were pressed by hand every morning by a woman named Giselle, who had been doing it since before the chef was born. Reservations required a deposit. The deposit was not refundable. Neither was your dignity, if you chose to leave it at the door. Josephine Merritt had worked there for 2 years, 3 months, and if she was being precise about it, 11 days. She was 28 years old. She had the kind of posture that came from years of carrying things carefully, and the kind of eyes that took in a room completely without appearing to look at anything. She wore her dark hair pulled back, not because it was required, but because she found it easier to think without it in her face. She had opinions about wine that she kept almost entirely to herself. She spoke when spoken to, answered questions precisely, and never let a glass sit empty long enough for a guest to notice it had been empty at all. The regulars liked her. The difficult ones respected her, which was rarer and meant more. What Josephine did not talk about, at Auberge Nordique or anywhere else, was the fact that she had been 3 semesters away from completing a joint degree in international law and linguistics at McGill when her mother's first diagnosis came in. That had been 4 years ago. The degree was still technically enrolled, technically possible, technically waiting for her in some administrative file in a building on Sherbrooke Street. But theoretical possibility and practical reality were 2 different countries. And Josephine had learned to live in the second one. Her mother, Anne Merritt, had been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's, and then, 14 months later, with a secondary condition that required medication not covered by their provincial plan. The math had been simple and brutal. Josephine's scholarship did not cover living expenses for 2 people. Her part-time income did not cover the medication, and the gap between what existed and what was needed had been exactly the size of her academic future. She had deferred, then deferred again, then taken the job at Auberge Nordique because it paid better than anything else she could find without a completed degree, and because the hours, difficult as they were, left her mornings free to take her mother to appointments. She had not told anyone at the restaurant any of this. It was not their business, and she was not the kind of person who made her circumstances someone else's problem. On a Thursday evening in late October, when the maple trees outside the windows had gone the color of embers and the first real cold of the season had settled into the city's bones, a reservation came in under the name Whitmore Vance. Josephine noticed it because she was the one who checked the reservation book each evening before service, and because the name was unusual, hyphenated, which sometimes indicated a corporate booking, a family event, or occasionally someone performing a certain kind of wealth for the benefit of their companions. The booking was for 4, prime table, the 7:30 slot. She thought nothing more of it. They arrived at 7:22, which was early enough to be slightly rude in the way that only people accustomed to making others wait ever are, arriving on their own schedule because it had simply never occurred to them that schedules existed for a reason. The man who walked in first was perhaps 55, with the kind of build that had once been athletic and had since become expensive. Expectancy. He wore a navy blazer with no tie, the casual elegance of someone who had decided long ago that ties were for people who needed to prove something, His hair was silver at the temples. His watch was the kind that did not need to announce itself. He introduced himself to the maître as though the introduction were a formidis, and doing the room's encanton, he was doing the room a favor by observing. His name, Josephine would learn, was Roland Vance. He was the founder and majority shareholder of Vance Meridian Capital, a private equity firm based in Toronto that had made its money acquiring mid-sized manufacturing companies across the prairies and restructuring them, which was a word that meant different things depending on whether you were a shareholder or an employee. He had been profiled in three national magazines in the past 2 years. He had opinions about everything and the particular confidence of a man who had never once been in a room where his opinions were not the most important ones present. The woman beside him was younger, perhaps 40, with the composed expression of someone managing multiple things simultaneously and doing it without visible effort. Her name was Dr. Patricia Sue, and she was the managing director of a pension fund with which Vance Meridian was apparently in the process of negotiating a significant partnership. She had flown in from Vancouver that afternoon. She ordered sparkling water and asked whether the chef could accommodate a minor shellfish sensitivity. And she said please when she asked, which Josephine noted. The other two were associates of Vance's, young men in their early 30s who had the look of people who had learned to exist in proximity to large egos and had made their peace with it. Josephine was assigned to the table. She introduced herself, recited the evening's tasting menu with the particular precision she brought to the task, not robotic, not performed, but genuine, the way someone speaks about something they actually know, and began. The first 40 minutes were unremarkable. Vance ordered assertively, asked questions that were mostly rhetorical, and made a point of demonstrating his wine knowledge to the table, which was moderate, though he spoke about it as though it were extensive. Dr. Sue asked two genuinely interesting questions about the provenance of the venison, which Josephine answered in detail. The associates ate and agreed with whatever Vance said. It was during the second course, a celery root velouté with black truffle and a single quenelle of crème fraîche, that Vance looked up from his bowl, studied Josephine for a moment in the way that certain men study service staff, as though cataloguing their adequacy, and said, in a light, conversational tone that was not conversational at all, "You're efficient. I'll give you that." Josephine said, "Tell me," Vance continued, reaching for his wine glass, "what do you actually know about what you're serving? Or is it memorization?" Dr. Sue glanced up briefly. Josephine kept her expression pleasant. "A bit of both, honestly. The memorization covers the menu. The knowing comes from following up with the kitchen." He tasted his wine, set the glass down. "My ex-wife used to say anyone could learn a script. The question was whether they understood it." He smiled at the table, as if he had said something clever. One of the associates nodded. Josephine did not respond to this, because there was nothing to respond to. The courses continued. The kitchen sent out a beautifully composed Arctic char with pickled fiddleheads and a foam that Josephine personally found slightly unnecessary, but that the guests seemed to enjoy. She poured the accompanying chablis with a care and retreated to give the table room. She was refilling the water glasses toward the end of the third course when it happened. Vance set down his fork. He looked across the table at Dr. Nisa. Then, deliberately, he looked at Josephine, with the particular expression of a man about to demonstrate something. "You know," he said, shifting his gaze between the two, "I spent 3 weeks in the Faroe Islands last summer. Remarkable place, completely isolated. The language," he paused, as if remembering something, "pleasant, is almost entirely inaccessible to outsiders. Took me 2 weeks just to get through basic pleasantries." He smiled. Then, In a fluid and apparently practiced shift, he turned to Josephine and spoke to her directly in what was unmistakably Faroese. Not a phrase or two, a full, complete sentence, delivered with the ease of someone who had put real effort into acquiring this particular trick. He was asking about the dessert course, or rather, he was asking about dessert in the same way a person asks a question when they already know the person they're asking cannot answer. The word's a vehicle for the demonstration, not the destination. At the table, one of the associates raised his eyebrows slightly. The other looked at his plate. Dr. Sue watched. Vance waited, the expression on his face pleasant in the specific way that a cat's expression is pleasant when it has cornered something. Josephine looked at him for exactly 1 beat. Then she answered him. In Faroese. Not haltingly, not with the careful pronunciation of someone who had memorized a phrase from a translation app the night before. She answered him the way you answer someone when you have spoken a language long enough that you no longer think in your first language when you use it, with the particular ease that cannot be performed, only earned. She told him, in Faroese, that the dessert this evening was a rhubarb and rosehip tart with an oat crumble, accompanied by a skyr mousse made in-house, and that the kitchen also offered, for those interested, a small selection of Quebecois cheeses. Then she waited. Vance stared at her. It was, she would think later, a very specific kind of stare. Not angry, not yet. Something more like the look of a man who had reached into a pocket where he expected to find something and found something else entirely. You speak Faroese, he said. In English, my grandmother was from Tórshavn, Josephine said, simply. She lived with us until I was 12. Dr. Sa set down her fork very carefully and looked at Vance with an expression that was professionally neutral and yet somehow communicated a great deal. The rhubarb tart sounds wonderful, she said to Josephine. I'll have that. Vance picked up his fork. He said nothing for a moment. Then, in the way of a man who is not accustomed to conceding ground and therefore pivots rather than retreats, he said, remarkable. He said it in the tone of a man paying a compliment when what he is doing is recovering his footing. Josephine thanked him mildly and went to put in the dessert order. In the kitchen, she stood for a moment beside the pass, her hand resting on the counter. The sous-chef, a compact woman named Brigitte, who had worked in this kitchen for 6 years, glanced at her. You okay? Fine, Josephine said. Table 4 needs 2 rhubarb tarts, 1 cheese plate, and 2 whatever Edouard feels like sending out. Brigitte squinted. What happened? Nothing, Josephine said, and went back out. What she did not say, and what nobody in that dining room could have known, was that the Faroese had been the least of it. Josephine Merritt spoke 4 languages with fluency, English and French as native tongues, Faroese from her grandmother's kitchen, and Mandarin, which she had picked up during an exchange year in Taipei that now felt like it had happened to a different person. She had a working knowledge of 2 others that she would not have called fluent, only serviceable. This was the product of a childhood spent listening carefully, a brain wired in a particular way, and 4 years of a linguistics degree she had not been allowed to finish. She had never once mentioned this at Auberge Nordique. There had been no reason to. Dessert service proceeded without incident. Vance was quieter, which Josephine recognized as a different kind of presence rather than an absence. Dr. Sue asked her, during a lull in the table's conversation where she had learned Faroese. Not with the pointed curiosity of someone making a point, but with what appeared to be genuine interest. Josephine told her, briefly, her grandmother, Sigrid, who had come to Montréal in the 1970s with a Faroese fisherman husband who had died young and left her stranded pleasantly in a city she came to love. Her grandmother had spoken Faroese at home, the way people speak a language when they want to keep something alive, deliberately, consistently, refusing to let it become just a memory. "She sounds wonderful," Dr. Sa said. "She was," Josephine said. She cleared the dessert plates and brought the mignardises, small chocolate-dipped candied orange peels, and a single pistachio financier per guest. The kitchen's way of saying the evening was drawing to its natural close. He looked at it, signed without hesitating, and added a tip that was, she noted, exactly standard. Not generous, not punitive. Exactly what a man adds to a bill when he is ensuring the transaction says nothing about him. He was standing from his chair when he said it. "You should be doing something else." He did not say it meanly. He said it the way people say things when they are processing something they did not expect. "Hip, I am doing something," she said, pleasantly. "I'm finishing. I'm seeing your table." Dr. Sa, who was pulling on her coat, made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh. Vance looked at Josephine for another moment. Then he said, "What's your name again?" "Josephine. Josephine." He nodded, as if confirming something. "Good evening." He walked out. Dr. Sa lingered for a moment after the others had moved toward the exit. She was a compact, precise woman, and she had the manner of someone who measured their words before spending them. She reached into her bag and produced a card, plain white, embossed lettering, the kind that costs more per unit than most people spend on lunch. She held it out to Josephine. "I'm here through Sunday," she said. "I'm looking for someone to join a small team we're building." Language background is relevant. International finance, cross-border negotiations, that sort of thing. She paused. "I realize that's an odd thing to say to someone who just served me dessert, but it seems to me you're somewhat overqualified for the room." Josephine took the card. She looked at it. Patricia Sue, MD. Meridian Pension Partners, followed by a Vancouver address and a number. "My background is incomplete," Josephine said. This was not false modesty. It was accurate. "Most useful backgrounds are," Dr. Seuss said. She picked up her scarf. "Have a good evening," and then she was gone too, and the door closed, and the dining room was quiet in the particular way. And dining rooms are quiet when the last guests of the evening have left, and the candles are still burning, and the tablecloths still carry the ghosts of the meal. Brigitte came out of the kitchen to wipe down the pass. She looked at Josephine standing near the window with a small white card in her hand. "What is that? A business card from who?" One of the guests. Brigitte dried her hands on her apron and looked at the card from across the room. The woman or the silver-haired one who kept straightening his cuffs? The woman? Brigitte considered this. She seemed like someone who knew things. She did, Josephine agreed. She slipped the card into her apron pocket and went to reset the table for tomorrow. She thought about it on the metro home, sitting in the orange plastic seat with her coat buttoned and her bag on her lap, watching the dark tunnel windows. She thought about it the way she had learned to think about things that mattered. Carefully, from multiple angles, without getting ahead of herself. She had learned this the hard way. Hope that moved too fast tended to arrive before the ground was ready for it. Her mother was awake when she got in. Anne Merritt sat in the armchair by the window with a book open in her lap, which was often how Josephine found her. Reading, or trying to, on the evenings when the tremors were manageable enough to hold a page. The lamp threw a warm light across the room. The apartment was small and kept with the kind of care that comes from respecting what you have. "Late night," her mother said. "Busy table," Josephine said, hanging up her coat. She filled a glass of water in the kitchen and brought it out. "How was the appointment?" "Unremarkable," Anne said, which was her word for tolerable. "Dr. Bergeron says the new dosage seems to be holding." She paused. "You look like something happened." Josephine sat down on the edge of the sofa. She was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled the card from her pocket and held it out. Her mother took it. She read it once, then again. She had the same eyes as Josephine, precise and careful and not easily impressed. She looked at the card for a long time. How did this come about? Josephine told her. The Faroese. The moment. Dr. Lingering after the others left. All of it. Her mother listened without interrupting. This was one of the things Josephine had always loved about her. She listened the way people listen when they understand that not everything needs a response right away. When Josephine finished, Anne looked at the card again. Then she looked at her daughter. Grandmaman would have found this very satisfying, she said. Josephine laughed, which surprised her slightly. It had been the right thing to say. It was almost always the right thing to say, invoking Sigrid. She would have been insufferable about it, Josephine said. Wonderfully insufferable, her mother agreed. They sat for a while in the lamplit room. The city was quiet outside. The first snow of the season had been forecast for the weekend, and Josephine found herself thinking about Sigrid, who had loved Montreal winters because she said they reminded her of home. Not the cold itself, but the quality of the dark, and stayed, not as a threat, but as a kind of company. Josephine looked at the card in her mother's hand. Josephine's about in her mother's hand. She thought about 3 semesters, about the administrative file on Sherbrooke Street that was still, technically, waiting. She thought about the gap between what existed and what was needed, and how that gap had defined the last 4 years of her life so completely that she had begun, without quite noticing, to mistake the gap for herself. She thought about Roland Vance, who had walked into a restaurant and looked at a young woman carrying a notepad and decided, in the efficient and automatic way of people who sought the world quickly, that he knew exactly what she was and what she was worth. She thought about the particular quality of his stare when she had answered him. That reaching into the wrong pocket look, and found, sitting here in her mother's lamplit apartment, that she felt less triumphant about it than she might have expected, and more tired. In the specific way, you are tired of something that has been happening your whole life, and that you have simply become very good at absorbing. She thought about Dr. Who had watched the whole thing and then done something Josephine had not expected, not made a speech about it, not mentioned it directly, just handed over a card and said something practical, as though the only reasonable response to recognizing what someone was capable of was to ask them to do it. Josephine reached over and took the card back from her mother. She held it between her thumb and forefinger. "I'm going to call her," she said. Her mother nodded, as though this had never been in question. "In the morning," Josephine added, because she was constitutionally incapable of doing anything impulsively. In the morning, her mother agreed. She closed her book. "Make tea first." Josephine went to the kitchen to make the tea. Standing at the stove with the kettle warming, she thought about one more thing. The moment between Vance's question and her answer, that single beat of silence before she had spoken. She had not hesitated because she didn't know what to say. She had paused because she had taken a fraction of a second to decide whether to let him have what he expected, whether to simply say, "I'm sorry, I don't understand," and let the moment pass, and let the evening continue, and let Roland Vance walk out of Auberge Nordique with his assumptions intact and his evening unruffled. She had chosen not to, not out of anger, not to perform anything or to win something, but because there was a version of the world in which she kept making that other choice, the quieter one, the one that cost her nothing in the moment and compounded interest every single day, and she was no longer willing to live in that version. Her grandmother had spoken Faroese every day of her life in this city, because she had decided that the language deserved to carrying it. A sound Josephine had never quite put it that way to herself before, but standing in her mother's kitchen with the kettle beginning to hiss, she thought, that's what it was, a decision to carry something. To not set it down just because the room didn't expect you to be holding it. The kettle boiled. She poured the tea. She put Dr. Seuss' card on the counter where she would see it first thing in the morning, and she went to sit with her mother, and outside the city of Montréal turned cold and quiet under a sky that was heavy with the season's first promised snow.